How does it feel to be a doctor when you yourself cannot save the person closest to you? When every minute counts, and your education, your hands, your essence, everything you knew how to do, suddenly stops working. That's the moment when you become an ordinary person, not a master in a white coat. Just like everyone else, helpless and weak. Imagine you're a surgeon. You're a lifeguard. You've saved the lives of thousands, you have years of practice, tens of thousands of successful surgeries under your belt. You know how to keep your cool in the most dire of situations. But what happens is that your son is lying on the operating table in front of you, and you realize that you can do nothing to save him. Your heart is pounding in your chest like crazy. Your hands are shaking. Your head is empty. The only thought in your eyes is, what did I do wrong? You reread in your mind all the textbooks, all the medical manuals, trying to remember anything that could help you, but no, nothing helps. You can't afford to panic. You have to stay professional, but this is your son. How do you live with that? Paul, his name echoes in your head like an echo, like a reminder that you failed. His face, his eyes, they can't be dead. They can't disappear. You had to do something. And there's this guilt that presses down like a mountain. You try to fight it, but it still comes, you can't save him. But what if there is another way? What if there's something else besides science that can help? Other methods that you've always thought were unreliable, ridiculous, and dangerous? This is the line that hides something you've never risked using. But maybe now is the moment? Who, if not you, can take that risk? How do you not lose your son when your own science doesn't provide the answer? That question is the question that will haunt you in every next moment. Your knowledge cannot help, your experience is useless, and you stand on the threshold of making the most terrible decision of your life. What will you choose? Science or faith in something greater? We start at this point. The very moment when your own principles collide with reality. And in that reality, not everything is as clear-cut as it seems. Victor stood at the window of his clinic, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked up into the dark sky. It was unbearably cold inside. From time to time he glanced around the office, examining the shelves of medical reference books, maps, photographs, pasted diplomas and awards. Everything he needed for his job was here, making him feel on top of his game. A doctor who saves lives. That's how he had felt his entire career, unrivaled, even when he had to deal with the most difficult cases. His life was built on discipline, precision, and strict rules. He loved his work because it gave him meaning. He was a surgeon who knew how to make the impossible possible. But behind all that majesty was an emptiness. When a doctor spends too much time in operating rooms, he forgets how to live properly outside of this world. Victor knew he had given more to his profession than to his family. The long hours at work, the meetings with colleagues, the tests, the surgeries. All of this remained his reality, not memories of his son. Pavel, his only son, grew up in his shadow. Victor was often busy treating other people's children, but he couldn't find time to just talk to his own. Pavel, you're an adult, you understand why I have to work so much. He seemed to explain everything to his son like an adult. He thought it was necessary to secure their future. And here he was, Victor, a man who saw death in the eyes of others, but couldn't see his son leaving. Time had flashed by, and now it was too late. Paul was sick, and nothing Victor knew helped. The medicine he had dedicated his life to was powerless. He consulted the best specialists, read every possible study, tried to find a way out, but the diagnosis was hopeless. How can you accept that your own knowledge, your best years, your passion for your profession cannot save your child? How do you come face to face with that despair? It wasn't just fear, it was an unbearable pain that squeezed Victor's heart and wouldn't let go. And in this world full of science, facts and evidence, he could find no explanation. He was facing the inexplicable, something that no book could explain. He was powerless. Papa, did you do something wrong? Pavel asked once, when the disease had taken the last of his strength. Victor gritted his teeth to keep from crying. He never allowed himself tears, not in his profession. But this question from his son proved fatal. Something crumbled inside him, and he realized that despite all his accomplishments, he had never been ready for this moment. He remembered how he had held him in his arms when he was first born. How full of hope he had been, how he had dreamed of teaching him everything he knew himself. He saw his future, a strong, healthy man who would one day carry on his work. But now this boy, the very Paul he loved more than life, was dying before his eyes. And there was nothing he could do. A dialogue with a colleague. "Victor, are you still hoping for a miracle?" asked Dr. Gerasimov, a friend of Victor's with whom they had worked together for many years. "What's left for me?" Victor threw his head back and looked up at the ceiling. "I've tried everything. I know it's not going to happen. I'm a doctor, for crying out loud. I know when there's a chance and when there isn't. But for him, I still keep believing. In something more, some kind of miracle, if you will. He's my son, and I can't put up with that." Gerasimov remained silent, watching Victor. He knew that he was not just worried. He was losing not only his son, he was losing his faith, his self-confidence, his knowledge. And worst of all, he couldn't get it back. Victor felt everything that had once seemed solid in his life slipping away. Medicine was no longer the solution. His world was beginning to crumble, and with it, all the ideas he believed in were crumbling. Every day his pain grew worse and nothing he did brought relief. He didn't know how to live in this world where there was no answer to the most important questions. Paul, who just yesterday had been full of life, could no longer speak, could not even lift his head. His eyes, which had always sparkled with curiosity, were now dull. It was hard for Victor to look at his son. He didn't know how to continue on this journey. The walls of the clinic, his familiar world, seemed alien. He was trapped, surrounded by those who were trying to help but didn't know how. He sat next to Paul's bed, losing himself more and more. Sometimes he closed his eyes to avoid his son's gaze, to avoid seeing in his eyes the emptiness that brought the end closer. Victor, a man who until that moment had always been confident of his strength, now felt that his hands were powerless. Everything he had known no longer mattered. And now, before him stood a reality he could never have imagined. He couldn't save him. All his greatness, all his titles, all his knowledge meant nothing. The only thing left was to watch the man you loved more than life go. Victor sat in his office, absorbed in a multitude of medical reports, studies and diagnoses, trying to find the slightest chance of salvation for Pavel. On his desk, among other papers, lay another pile of reports, and they were all the same. The verdict was the same: incurable. How was that possible? How many years had he devoted to studying medicine, to treating, to saving lives? Why did his son become the one who was beyond his reach? Out of desperation, Victor tossed aside another folder of test results, and his gaze fell on a photograph of Pavel, taken when he was still a child, where he was smiling, sitting in his father's arms. Victor gritted his teeth, trying to suppress the tears, but they broke through his tired face. He couldn't remember the last time he and Pavel had just sat, talked, laughed. He'd given all these years to his work, and now, at the very moment when his son needed him most, he was helpless. All his knowledge, his experience didn't matter. The phone rang. Victor flinched, not expecting the call. It was Dr. Gerasimov. "Victor, I know you've tried everything, but listen to me. I've heard of a method that his voice trailed off for a few seconds before continuing. It's not exactly official, but if you want to try it." Victor paused, then answered with weariness in his voice. "You mean there's something I don't know about? You want to offer me another insanity, don't you?" Gerasimov sighed heavily. "I'm not crazy about the idea myself, Victor, but if you want to save Pavel, you should think about it. There's a man, Carlos. He's not from our circle, but his methods seem unusual, and possibly effective. If you're willing to take the risk, I can arrange a meeting." Victor didn't know what to do. His mind was filled with doubt. His son was getting worse by the day, and he could no longer sit idly by. He was willing to do anything to give him his life back, but what if this was just another useless delusion? But what if this was the only hope? Carlos met him at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Victor realized immediately that this was no ordinary doctor. His gaze was sharp but cold, his manner of speaking straightforward, almost aggressive. Carlos was a man you wouldn't want to argue with, but at the same time you could feel his certainty, as if he knew something no one else did. "Victor, you came here because you couldn't find a solution in official medicine, right?" Carlos didn't waste time on unnecessary greetings. "Yes, but I don't want to do something that will hurt my son," Victor replied, feeling his voice begin to tremble. "If you think I've lost my mind, you're wrong." Carlos smiled, as if expecting those words. "I understand your anxiety. But I know what you're looking for, and I know you don't want to lose it. What I'm suggesting is not what you're used to seeing in medical books. It is a method that has not been scientifically tested, And yes, I use methods that are sometimes called unorthodox. However, I have results that speak for themselves." Victor couldn't believe it. He felt his heart clench. This was too risky, too dangerous to seriously consider. He had always been someone who believed only in science, only in evidence, in proven studies and solutions. It all seemed unimaginable. "And what is this method?" he asked, holding back his indignation. Carlos explained that there are a number of experimental treatments that are outside of conventional medicine, including the use of little-known drugs, innovative approaches to treatment that seem radical and even controversial. He talked about methods that have not yet been endorsed by the big medical establishment, but in his practice they have produced results. "Victor, you can still see that the medicine you're used to isn't giving your son a chance. Maybe it's time to look outside the box. Are you willing to risk it for his life?" Victor remained silent. Every instinct he had was screaming no. He knew that such a move could cost him not only his career, but also his reputation. It could lead to disaster. But what if it was still a chance? "Do you promise it won't lead to more deterioration?" His voice was barely audible. Carlos didn't answer immediately. It was as if he was waiting for this question. Finally, with a cold and confident expression on his face, he said, "No guarantees, Victor. But if you don't try, you'll lose him. This is your last chance." Victor felt his mind begin to surrender under the weight of what he had heard. He searched desperately for any clue, anything that might convince him, but found nothing. His only choice was to risk it. To risk everything he knew, all his principles. But maybe that was the only option. "All right," he said, feeling his chest constrict with fear. "I'll agree to that. But I'll keep you under strict control." Carlos nodded, his eyes sparkling with satisfaction. He knew he had won. The next day, Victor returned home to find Paul still lying in his bed, weak and almost lifeless. He didn't know what would come of this, but his heart wouldn't allow him to just sit and wait. He was willing to take any risk. If it would help his son, so be it. He began to gather documents, preparing for the next step. He thought about the possible consequences, that if things went wrong, it could be disastrous. But perhaps this was the last chance he could give his son. Victor couldn't stop himself. He was on the brink, and perhaps it was his decision that would determine the future of his family. The moment he was about to take that final step, he felt his hands shaking. But despite his fear, Victor made his decision. This time, for Pavel's sake, he was willing to experience the impossible. Victor stood at the window, trying to gather his thoughts. Night was descending on the city, and outside its windows the last hopes were disappearing in the darkness like an abyss. With every moment, his sense of dread only grew. He didn't know what would happen next, but he couldn't back down. In his hands he held a stack of documents that described all the details of the treatment Carlos had proposed. He was willing to take the risk. But now, in the silence of the night, that risk seemed far more dangerous than it had seemed before. The method Victor had agreed to try on his son wasn't just unconventional. It was highly controversial and had not yet been recognized by official medicine. Several scientists and researchers had tested these techniques in their practice, but in most cases the results were unpredictable. All this created the feeling that Victor was going into the unknown. The feeling of uneasiness did not leave him, but he could not allow himself to retreat. He was willing to risk everything to get Paul back. When Victor had first used Carlos' method, he had tried to stay cool, knowing that this was a chance that could change everything. At first, everything seemed normal. Paul, despite his weakness, had stayed with him, albeit in a serious condition. However, something in his gaze, in his eyes, was becoming more and more alienated. Victor tried not to think about it, focusing all his attention on the drugs and procedures that were being administered as Carlos had instructed. However, the situation was becoming more confusing by the day. A few days after the treatment began, Paul's condition began to deteriorate. Victor noticed the first signs of complications: rapid breathing, sharp pains that could not be alleviated by either medication or sedation. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had followed the instructions, done everything as told, but the result was the exact opposite of what he had hoped for. His heart clenched with fear as he watched his son's condition worsen. Every day Victor cursed himself for having decided to take this risk. He searched desperately for answers, but all attempts to find an explanation for his failure remained futile. Why wasn't Paul, after all his efforts, getting better? Why at some point had the treatment turned into a torment for his son? Victor could no longer hold back his tears. He could feel his strength draining away as despair filled every cell in his body. He had lost control. Carlos' method was proving to be not only unpredictable, but dangerous. Victor began to notice that his son began to weaken faster than before. He lacked the strength to fight, lacked what he had before, the energy, the life in his eyes. His body was no longer responding to the medication, his skin was growing paler and his breathing more and more intermittent. One evening, after Victor once again tried to give Paul the necessary dose of medication, his son looked almost unconscious. Victor, feeling hopeless, tried to quell this inner fear that was eating him up from the inside out. Every time he watched Paul suffer, his heart bled. He realized that this pain wasn't just physical, it was the anguish of realizing that he himself had created this trap. Paul stopped asking how he was feeling. He simply remained silent. This silence became even heavier than any words. Victor felt the panic rising inside him, the panic of losing himself, of losing his son. He couldn't believe that his own treatment was making his condition worse. He tried to think rationally, to find the strength to keep fighting. But with each passing day, his world grew grayer and his hope grew dimmer. It was at that moment that Carlos disappeared. This wasn't part of the plan, and Victor wasn't ready for it. He tried calling him several times, but the phone went unanswered. Carlos never made contact, never came to explain what was going on. Victor could feel his anger and helplessness growing within him. How could anyone leave him in this situation? He decided that this method was not only insane, but criminal. But it was too late to undo everything that had already been done. Every morning Victor woke up with the hope that Paul's condition would improve, that at least for a second his son would open his eyes and say that everything had passed. But it was the opposite. Pavel was sinking deeper and deeper into the fog, his body drained of energy. Victor tried to find answers by examining the documents Carlos had left behind, but things were only getting worse. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming him. Pavel became a mute shadow of the man he used to be. Victor didn't know how to continue. He was ready to break the cycle, but he didn't know how to find a way out. He couldn't forgive himself for taking this step, for believing in a method that turned out to be only an illusion. He remembered how he had once felt proud of his work, of his ability to help people. And now he was faced with his own inability to help the person closest to him. The feeling pressed unbearably on his mind. He was losing not only his son, but himself. He had lost all his confidence. Everything around him seemed shaky and unstable. It was scary to take risks, but he no longer knew how to stop. He was acting like a man who couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but kept walking into the void. He tried to talk himself into believing that there would be at least one drop of hope after all. That he just had to keep going and keep fighting. But every day, as Paul grew weaker and weaker, that inner voice grew quieter and quieter. A sense of hopelessness and loss was gripping Victor, making him question his decision. Every look at his son, every breath he took, every gesture he made became more and more painful for Victor. He felt everything around him collapsing, and he didn't know how to fight this nightmare. Victor sat on the edge of Pavel's bed, his face pale and his eyes filled with pain. He was silent, listening to the soft, faint sound of his son's breathing. Paul lay unmoving, his body losing all strength, and Victor couldn't stop thinking, "It's my fault." He clenched his fists, trying to hold back the tears, but they came, stinging and cold. He could no longer ignore the fact that everything he'd done had turned out to be a mistake. The medical science to which he had devoted his life no longer seemed like salvation. He was a master, a surgeon, a man who had a history of saving the lives of others, who stood beyond fear and doubt. But now that all his confidence and experience were powerless in the face of his son's illness, he realized that he had been deceived. He believed that this risk, the risk he had taken, was justified. He wanted Paul back, but instead he was losing him, day by day. He could feel something inside him crumbling. There was no more pride in his accomplishments, in his successful operations and professional victories. All he saw now was pain and an unbearable sense of his own helplessness. Everything he taught people, what he explained in lectures and in the operating room, was in vain. Every day he went deeper and deeper into his inner world, which became darker and darker. He often thought back to his life, remembering moments that had seemed so insignificant to him, but were now a pipe dream. He thought of those days when he was still young, when Pavel had been a little boy, full of life and hope. How they had walked together in the park, how he had taught him how to ride a bicycle. Victor had always been there for him, but not as much as he would have liked. He was always busy. He was teaching his students, writing research papers, working in the operating room. In those moments when Paul needed him most, he preferred to work. And now, as his son was dying, Victor realized what he'd lost all those years, what he and Paul had never gotten to experience together. All he could do was regret not being there for him. Victor remembered how once Pavel had come home with a strange expression on his face, as if he had something important to say. But Victor was busy, another case, an emergency operation. He remembered saying to his son, "Not now, Pavel, later." And he gave up. He retired to his room, leaving Victor with his worries and cases. Victor realized that he would never get that moment back. He could have stopped, listened to his son talked. But instead he chose to work. Now that moment hung in the air like an angry reminder of his mistakes. It was as if an invisible hand was clutching his chest. Victor closed his eyes, trying to picture the little boy who had once been his pride. The one who could have grown into a man like him. But now all of that was ruined. The thought kept echoing in his head, I wasn't there for him. I wasn't there for him when he needed me. Every day that he stayed by Paul's side, Victor felt his own heart break. It wasn't just physical pain. It was a guilt that grew more unbearable by the hour. He was beginning to doubt himself, his ability to be a good father, his right to be called a man who could help his son. All those years of believing that saving other people's lives was the most important thing now seemed like a terrible illusion. He searched for meaning, but all he found was emptiness. He thought about how things could have been different. How he could have been there for Paul when he was just starting to get sick. Maybe then he would have noticed the changes, known what to do, and would have been able to make a difference. Maybe if he had left his job, not rushed to the operating room, and just sat with his son, talked to him, things would have been different. He could feel these thoughts tormenting him, consuming him, a hellish sense of guilt slowly consuming his entire being. Victor got out of bed and went to the window. The city was engulfed in darkness, and in the light of the street lamps everything looked empty and alien. He could feel the world around him becoming just as cold and empty. He had lost his place in it. He had lost everything he once had. His professional accomplishments meant nothing at the moment he was facing this loss. He was a master who could save other people's lives, but he couldn't save the one he loved. He thought of his son, of how often they had misunderstood each other. Victor had tried to be a role model for him, teaching him how to be strong, how not to give up. But now, with his son's life hanging in the balance, Victor realized that they had never learned how to be friends. He hadn't been there for him in those moments when Paul needed his father. He had thought that everything would resolve itself, that everything would be okay, but he couldn't imagine that life would turn out this way. Guilt squeezed his chest. He couldn't forgive himself for not having time to be there for her. That he had been too busy to notice how his son was suffering. He remembered the moments when Paul had come to him with the joy of some small victories, when he was just a child, full of enthusiasm. Victor clenched his teeth. He couldn't believe that all he could do for him was regret the lost moments. Inside Victor, everything was clenching. He couldn't forgive himself. His whole inner being protested, but what could he do? He was losing not only his son, but also his faith in himself. Victor woke up early in the morning, as he always did, but every day it was getting harder and harder to make himself get out of bed. He was no longer the man he used to be. He was a shadow of himself, exhausted, confused, tired. Each new day brought him only more pain and regret. He looked at his son, his body without the strength to fight. He heard only Paul's faint breathing, which sounded like a sentence, like the sounds of the end. Victor didn't know how to be. He had lost faith, and there was no turning back. But just when Victor was ready to give up, his life took an unexpected turn. One evening, a phone call rang in his office. Victor didn't know who might be calling, but when he answered, he heard a familiar voice. "Victor, don't you remember me? It's Igor." Igor. An old friend Victor hadn't seen in years. Victor froze for a moment, trying to remember how he could know him. Igor was one of his old university colleagues, a man with whom they had developed various medical projects and exchanged ideas many years ago. Igor had gone into private practice and had long ago stopped keeping in touch with Victor, and now he called unexpectedly. "Igor, how are you? Why are you?" Victor didn't know what to say. "I heard about your situation with Pavel," Igor interrupted. "Victor, I found something that might help." Victor felt his heart skip a beat. He didn't know what to expect, but his intuition told him that this could be another chance. He began to listen as Igor explained that he had found a method that, while informal, had shown amazing results. Igor spoke quickly, like a man who had found what he was looking for and now wanted to share it with another. He didn't give details about the method, but his confidence was conveyed in every word. "Can you hear me? Victor, you have to try this. I can't explain it to you fully, but I can tell you one thing, I've witnessed it work. I have patients who have experienced what seemed impossible. You know? It works. I'll send you all the details." Victor's heart was pounding faster than usual. He couldn't believe his ears. He tried to remain skeptical, tried to figure out what the method was, but everything inside him was screaming, "Try it. This could be your last chance." That night Victor couldn't sleep. He thought about the method Igor had suggested. He didn't know what it was exactly, but everything kept going on in his mind. What if this really was the chance he had been waiting for? As scary as it was, he was willing to take the risk. He couldn't keep watching his son die in front of him. He couldn't keep sitting around waiting for a miracle to happen to him. Victor realized that if he didn't try, he would lose everything. A few days later, he was already holding the schematic of the method Igor had recommended. The method was unofficial, and had not yet been approved by the major medical institutions. It was hidden from the public eye, and the details remained in the shadows. Despite all this, however, Victor felt some strange sense of hope within himself. He was willing to give it a try. He sprang into action, following the instructions Igor had given him. Victor saw Pavel's condition begin to improve slightly. He couldn't believe that after everything that had happened, he was suddenly starting to see signs of improvement. Every morning when he entered the room, he noticed more and more often that Pavel was a little more alert. His breathing was smoother and his complexion was a little more lively. It was like a miracle that no one could explain. Each new day brought new signs of improvement, but despite this, Victor couldn't believe it. He searched for an explanation for this phenomenon, but there was no answer. None of the medical experts could give a clear explanation of what was happening. The method was untested, and there was no guarantee that it would work. And yet, Pavel's condition improved day by day. Victor, sitting next to his son, couldn't understand what was happening. Everything was mixed in his mind: guilt, fear, and finally, uncertain hope. Weeks passed, and Victor couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of something more. He felt like he couldn't stop, that this strange hope was all he had left. But the more he saw Paul grow stronger, the more he doubted. Why is this working? What don't I know? Every time Victor came into the study and looked at his son's improvements, his thoughts returned to Igor. He couldn't figure out exactly what had saved Pavel. Was it the medication? Or was it just a happy accident? Or perhaps something else, unknown to science, had made a difference? But what was strangest of all was that the more improvements occurred, the more Victor felt his life spiraling out of control again. Every step, every decision seemed more uncertain now. He didn't know exactly what had saved his son, but he was sure it had been more than just luck. The process of Paul's recovery continued, but Victor felt his own life losing clarity. He could no longer tell exactly what was real and what was just a mirage. And while Paul was slowly coming back to life, Victor was increasingly losing contact with reality, with himself. He no longer knew who to believe or what was true. He continued down this path, doubting that he would even know how it all happened in the end. And each new step only confused him more. Why was it working? Why did Paul become a better person? All the answers were hidden like a fog, and Victor no longer knew how to fight this feeling of uncertainty that clutched his soul. It had been several weeks since Victor had started using the method suggested by Igor. Every day Pavel's condition improved. He was no longer lying motionless, his eyes began to sparkle again, his face, though still pale, gained some liveliness. Victor couldn't believe it. He kept checking the documents, studying the method, going back to what he had seen with his own eyes, but he could find no logical explanation. Pavel sat in the chair, smiling at his father. It was the day Victor looked at him for the last time and said to himself, "He's back. He's back." The son who had been on the verge of death was now sitting next to him, looking up at him and saying words that hadn't been spoken in this house in a long time. "Thank you, Dad. You saved me." Victor didn't know what had really saved his son. The medication? The method? Or was it simply a miracle? Something greater that couldn't be explained in words. But, as it were, he kept looking for an explanation. He tried to link facts and numbers, conclusions and research, but no answers came. Igor, who had once recommended this method, disappeared just as he had appeared. He didn't get in touch, didn't explain what was really going on. Victor tried to understand why it all worked, but he felt his thoughts slipping away from him. The feeling was familiar to him. His life, his work, his efforts in the operating rooms, it had all always been logical and explainable. He knew how science worked, how medicine worked. But this time it was different. This time he was faced with something that defied explanation. Each day as he watched Paul's recovery, Victor felt his own life becoming more and more unclear. He was beginning to realize that you can't always control everything that happens around you. You can't always predict the outcome, even if you're a professional, even if you're the one behind the science and the facts. He felt it in every step, in every look at his son. Sometimes he would just sit next to him and be silent. His mind was full of questions, but there were no answers. Victor thought about those moments when he had sat in the operating room, when his decisions had saved lives, and everything had seemed so simple, so clear. He thought about how he was in control of everything, how he believed in his own strength and knew that every action he took would have a result. But now, sitting next to Paul, he could feel those certainties dissolving. He didn't know why his son had recovered. It could have been a miracle, it could have been an accident. He couldn't make up his mind as to what exactly had saved Paul. He couldn't forget that moment when he first saw his son deteriorate, when he thought he had lost him. Victor felt so weak, so vulnerable in that moment. He knew that medicine couldn't help, and at some point he began to look for something more. It was a worry that wouldn't let him go. And now, as he watched his son begin to live again, Victor felt more and more that the world he lived in was no longer the same. He could no longer control everything that was happening to him, to his family. Paul became active again. He started walking, talking, laughing. He was back to normal, but Victor continued to feel this emptiness inside. There was nothing more paradoxical than his own feeling. He couldn't explain what had happened. And that was probably the worst part for him, not knowing why he had won, why his son had won. Every morning, when Victor came to Pavel's room, he felt a slight anxiety, but now it was no longer related to his son's illness. It was an anxiety for something that remained unexplored, undiscovered, that could not be rationally explained. Victor realized that science does not always give answers to the most important questions. Sometimes what was happening could not be analyzed in any way. It was like jumping into the void, where there was no clear path. He tried again and again to find an explanation, but time passed and the answers never came. He began to realize that maybe this was the answer. Sometimes life gives you something you can't explain, and it doesn't always require an explanation. Sometimes what seems impossible just happens. And you can't resist it. You just accept it. When Paul came up to Victor that day and said, "Dad, thank you. You saved me," Victor realized that actually saving his son had nothing to do with medical methods or even a miracle. It had to do with the fact that he didn't give up, that he kept looking, that he was there for him when he needed him. And that was what was most important. It was what had truly saved them both. Now, looking back, Victor knew that it was more important than any scientific theories and hypotheses. Sometimes the most important thing is just being there for you, despite all the doubts and fears. Sometimes it wasn't the answers that mattered, it was what you did without knowing what the outcome would be. He realized that you don't always have to look for an explanation. Sometimes life just happens and you can't control its course. Victor looked at his son, who was getting stronger every day, and thought less and less about what led to this. He wasn't looking for all the answers anymore. He was just grateful to have the chance to watch him smile. For having his son with him again. And perhaps that was the miracle that needed no explanation. But questions remain that will never be answered. What really saved Paul? Was it a miracle or just an accident? There will be no answer. And perhaps that's the most important thing. Sometimes the truth is hidden and you can't find it, not because you don't want to, but because it's just not searchable. The ending was simple. Paul was alive, and to Victor that was all that mattered. Questions remained, but the answers weren't as important. Victor stood at the window, looking out at the rising sun. His eyes were clear, but there was still a shadow of doubt inside. He had experienced loss, experienced pain that was hard to describe in words, and despite everything that had happened, he was still searching for answers. But now he realized that perhaps it wasn't the answers that were more important, but the process of searching. Everything he had experienced had opened his eyes to the fact that you can't always find answers right away. Life doesn't always lend itself to logic and scientific explanation. Sometimes you just have to keep moving forward. Paul was with him, alive and strong. And that was what mattered most to Victor. He learned that despite the uncertainty, the fears and the pain, you have to keep looking, keep working, keep believing. That every new day is a chance. A chance for improvement, a chance for recovery, a chance for change. But the answers he'd been searching for so long were still somewhere far away. What had saved his son? Was it a miracle or a fluke? He didn't know, and he probably never would. But that wasn't important. What mattered was that he hadn't given up. That he kept searching, despite all the difficulties and doubts. And that was the point of his journey. Victor wasn't ready to stop. He knew that there were still many uncharted roads ahead, many unanswered questions, but he was not afraid. He realized that you don't always need to know everything. Sometimes it was enough just to go forward, trusting his heart, believing in the future, in the possibility of change. And that was what gave him the strength to move forward.